Let's talk about the biggest, most successful, and most completely unlikely corporate takeover in all of history. How on earth did that happen? How did Jupiter, Mars, and the whole divine gang on Mount Olympus end up unemployed, their temples shuttered, and their altars cold? To understand this incredible story, we first need to take a look at the market they were breaking into. We need to understand the strange and deeply transactional world of Roman religion that existed before the Christians showed up and flipped the whole table over.
At the heart of the official Roman state religion was a very simple and not very romantic idea, the Pax Deorum, which translates to the peace of the gods. The Romans saw their relationship with their gods less like a loving family and more like a business contract with a very powerful and frankly quite moody celestial business partner. The deal was this: the people of Rome, through their priests, would perform all the correct sacrifices, say all the right prayers, and hold all the right festivals at exactly the right times. It was all about procedure. In return for this meticulous, respectful service, the gods would hold up their end of the bargain. They would grant Rome victory in battle, ensure good harvests, and generally keep the empire from collapsing. This was the Pax Deorum. It wasn't a feeling of inner peace, it was a state of cosmic stability, a divine non-aggression pact. If Rome did its part, the gods were happy and the empire prospered. But if Rome messed up, if a priest mumbled the wrong line in a prayer, or if a sacrifice wasn't performed perfectly, then the gods would get angry. And when the gods got angry, bad things happened. The army might lose a battle, a plague might sweep through the city, or a harvest might fail. This meant that Roman religion wasn't really about personal faith or morality. You didn't have to believe in Jupiter in your heart. You just had to show up and make sure the bull was sacrificed correctly. It was a civic duty, like paying your taxes or serving in the army. The whole system was a kind of divine bureaucracy designed to keep the universe running smoothly. The priests weren't spiritual guides. They were more like divine lawyers, making sure the fine print of the contract with the gods was being followed to the letter. It was a practical, if rather cold, way of looking at the universe, and it worked for a while.
So, what was it like being a Roman god? Let's take the big boss, Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the best and greatest. His temple on the Capitoline Hill was the most important in Rome, the divine equivalent of the corporate headquarters. His job, for the most part, was to sit on his throne and not smite Rome as long as his contracts were being honored. His inbox was constantly full. A new consul taking office would come and sacrifice a white bull to him to kick off the political year. A general heading off to fight the Germans would promise him a new temple or a share of the loot in exchange for a decisive victory. A senator whose daughter was sick might promise Jupiter a statue if she recovered. It was an endless stream of, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. Jupiter was less of a loving father and more of a cosmic transactional lawyer, constantly vetting proposals and cashing in on successful ventures. He wasn't that concerned with whether you were a good person. He was concerned with whether you were a good Roman. You could be a corrupt politician who was cheating on your wife and skimming money from the treasury, but as long as you performed your public religious duties with the proper respect, Jupiter was happy. It was all about outward appearances. This approach to religion was great for the state. It created a sense of shared civic identity and divine purpose. But for the individual, it wasn't always that fulfilling. The great gods of Rome might protect the legions, but they didn't have much to say about your personal fears, your anxieties about death, or your hope for a better life. The gods took care of the big picture, but they were terrible at customer service.
As the Republic gave way to the Empire, a new figure entered this divine business relationship, the Emperor. This led to the imperial cult, which sounds a lot weirder than it actually was. When you hear that Romans worshiped their emperors, you might picture people praying to a statue of Augustus to cure their sick cat. But for the most part, it wasn't like that. Worshipping the emperor wasn't really about believing he was a god who could throw lightning bolts. It was the Roman version of the Pledge of Allegiance, a universal test of loyalty in a massive, diverse empire. Here's how it worked. A good emperor, after he died, could be officially voted into the pantheon of gods by the Senate. He became a divus, a divine being, and would get his own temples and priests. But while an emperor was alive, he wasn't technically a god himself. Instead, Romans were expected to honor his genius, which was a sort of personal guardian spirit that every man was believed to have. The emperor's genius was just, a bit more important than everyone else's. The actual act of worship was incredibly simple. It usually involved just dropping a pinch of incense or pouring a drop of wine on an altar in front of a statue of the emperor. It was a loyalty checkbox. You did it to show that you were a good, loyal Roman who supported the state and the man in charge. It was a political act, not a deeply spiritual one. This is a crucial point because it was exactly this simple political act that the Christians would refuse to do. And that refusal, that stubbornness, would be seen by the Roman authorities not as a matter of religious principle, but as an act of treason.
While the big state gods handled the affairs of the empire, and the emperor's cult handled the politics, there was a whole other level of religion that was much more personal: the worship of the household gods. Every single Roman family, from the wealthiest senator to the poorest shopkeeper, had its own set of private deities who looked after the home. It was like a divine home security system. The most important of these were the Lares and the Penates. The Penates were the gods of the pantry, the spirits who made sure the family's food supply was safe and plentiful. The Lares were generally thought to be the spirits of the family's founding ancestors, ghosts who stuck around to protect their descendants and their property. Every home had a special shrine for these gods, called a lararium. In a poor family's apartment, it might just be a small painted niche in the wall with a little shelf. In a rich person's villa, it could be a magnificent freestanding marble shrine in the atrium. This was the spiritual heart of the home. The head of the family, the paterfamilias, would act as the priest for his own household. Every day, small offerings of food, like a bit of bread or a drop of wine, would be placed at the shrine or thrown into the fire of the hearth. There were special prayers for family birthdays, weddings, and funerals. This was the most intimate and consistent religious experience for most Romans. It was deeply tied to family, tradition, and the memory of one's ancestors. It was a religion of belonging. But just like the state religion, it was still largely transactional. You made the offerings to keep the spirits happy so they would keep the house safe and the family healthy. It provided comfort and a sense of continuity, but it didn't really offer answers to life's biggest questions. What happens after we die? Why is there suffering in the world? For those kinds of questions, many Romans started looking elsewhere.
The official Roman religious system was solid and dependable, like a government utility. It took care of the big picture, keeping the state safe and the family secure, but it wasn't very exciting. It was a religion of procedure, not passion. It didn't offer a deep personal connection, a sense of spiritual ecstasy, or, most importantly, a clear and hopeful vision of the afterlife. The standard Roman afterlife was a gloomy, gray, miserable place, a shadowy underworld where you just sort of existed as a pale imitation of your former self. It was not something to look forward to. This spiritual void created a huge opening in the market for new, exciting, and more personally fulfilling religious options, and the Roman Empire, with its vast trade networks and open borders, was flooded with them. This is the era of the mystery cults, which we can think of as trendy, imported spiritual brands that offered a much better package than the old domestic gods. These cults, which mostly came from the eastern provinces like Egypt and Persia, all shared a few key features that made them incredibly popular. They were voluntary. You chose to join. You weren't born into it. They were secret. Their most important rituals and beliefs were hidden from outsiders, revealed only to initiated members. This gave them an air of exclusive, special knowledge. And they all offered a powerful, emotional, personal connection with a specific deity. But their killer app, the feature that drew in millions of followers, was the promise of a blessed and happy afterlife. They promised that if you followed their path, you wouldn't end up in the gray gloom of Hades, but in a place of eternal bliss.
One of the hottest brands in the spiritual marketplace was the cult of the Egyptian goddess Isis. Her story was a blockbuster drama of love, betrayal, death, and resurrection, which made her instantly relatable in a way that a stoic, official god like Jupiter could never be. The myth, in a nutshell, is this. Isis's husband, the god Osiris, was murdered and chopped into little pieces by his evil brother Set. The ever-faithful Isis then traveled all over the world, painstakingly collecting the pieces of her husband. Once she had them all, she used her powerful magic to put him back together and bring him back to life. This story was the core of her appeal. She was a goddess who had suffered. She understood grief, loss, and the pain of mortality. And most importantly, she had conquered death itself. Joining her cult was an intense emotional experience. It involved secret initiation ceremonies that often symbolized a kind of personal death and rebirth. An initiate might be taken into a dark, underground chamber, subjected to terrifying sights and sounds, before emerging into a brilliantly lit room, purified and reborn as a true follower of the goddess. These rituals created a powerful personal bond between the worshiper and the deity. Isis was a compassionate, maternal figure who promised to care for her followers in this life and the next. Her temples were beautiful, filled with exotic Egyptian art, professional priests, and daily ceremonies with music and chanting. And unlike some other cults, her embrace was universal. She welcomed men and women, slaves and senators. Her cult was particularly popular with women, who saw in her a powerful and loving female deity they could connect with directly, a welcome change from the male-dominated official pantheon. While Isis was winning hearts with her universal message of compassion, another major import was cornering a different demographic. This was the cult of Mithras, a Persian sun god whose religion was, for all intents and purposes, a cosmic fraternity for men only. If the cult of Isis was an open-to-all spiritual movement, Mithraism was the exclusive secret society. This cult was especially popular with soldiers, merchants, and imperial bureaucrats. These were men whose lives were defined by hierarchy, discipline, and a sense of brotherhood, and Mithraism was structured in a way that felt very familiar to them. It was a highly organized religion with 7 progressive levels of initiation, from raven at the bottom to father at the top. Each level had its own secret passwords, rituals, and tests, creating a powerful sense of advancement and shared secret knowledge. It was like a spiritual version of the army's chain of command, or a corporate ladder to enlightenment. Mithraism was also defined by its secrecy. There were no grand public temples. Its followers met in small private groups in underground chambers called Mithraea. These were designed to look like the cave in which Mithras performed his most important act, the slaying of a sacred bull, an event known as the Tauroctony. A statue or carving of this dramatic, bloody scene was the centerpiece of every Mithraeum. This act of sacrifice was believed to be the source of all life and creation, a primal event
that guaranteed the salvation of the cult's members. The meetings often involved a shared ritual meal, reinforcing the bonds between the brothers. It was a religion that offered men a sense of order in a chaotic world, a strict moral code, and a powerful sense of belonging to an elite secret team.
For the Roman elite, who found all this emotional, ritualistic, religious stuff a bit messy, there was another option available in the marketplace: philosophy. For a certain kind of educated, upper-class Roman, a school of Greek philosophy like Stoicism was their true religion. It provided what the state gods in the mystery cults often didn't: a rational, logical, and complete framework for how to live a good and meaningful life. Stoicism, in particular, was the ultimate wellness brand for the Roman C-suite. It was the philosophy of choice for senators, generals, and even emperors like Marcus Aurelius. Stoicism taught that the universe was a rational, orderly place, governed by a divine principle called the Logos. The key to a happy life was to live in accordance with this rational order. This meant focusing only on what you could control: your own thoughts, your own judgments, your own actions, and being completely indifferent to everything you couldn't control, which included pretty much everything: your health, your wealth, your reputation, and even whether you lived or died. It was a tough, demanding philosophy of self-discipline. It taught you to endure hardship without complaint, to do your civic duty, and to master your own emotions. It was a spiritual boot camp for the soul. It didn't promise you a blessed afterlife with the gods, but it did promise a kind of salvation in this life, a state of inner peace and tranquility called apatia that could not be disturbed by the chaos of the outside world. For a Roman aristocrat whose life was often a roller coaster of political intrigue, war, and unpredictable emperors, the appeal of this internal, unshakable fortress was immense.
So this is the world we find ourselves in at the dawn of the Roman Empire. It is not a world with a single unified faith. It is a vibrant, diverse, and deeply competitive spiritual marketplace. The shelves are packed with options, catering to every possible consumer. If you're a patriotic traditionalist, you have the grand official state cult of Jupiter in the gang, a reliable, if somewhat boring, legacy brand. If you're a homebody, you have the intimate, comforting worship of your ancestral spirits. If you're a woman, or anyone looking for a more personal, emotional connection and a happy afterlife, the compassionate international brand of Isis is open for business. If you're a soldier or a bureaucrat who values order and brotherhood, the exclusive members-only club of Mithras is for you. And if you're a highly educated aristocrat who wants a rational, no-nonsense guide to life, you can subscribe to the premium intellectual brand of Stoicism. You could even mix and match. A Roman senator could make a public sacrifice to Jupiter in the morning, tend to his household shrine in the afternoon, attend a secret meeting in a Mithraeum at night, and read the Stoic philosophers before bed. The system was, for the most part, tolerant and inclusive. It was an and religion, not an or religion. The stage is perfectly set. The market is crowded, the customers are sophisticated, but many of them are deeply unsatisfied with the existing products. It is a market ripe for disruption. And a radical new startup with a completely unprecedented business model is about to arrive from the province of Judea.
Before we can talk about Christianity, we have to talk about its parent company, Judaism. In the diverse, anything-goes religious world of the Roman Empire, Judaism was the odd one out. It was, for a start, ancient. While the Romans might have found Jewish customs strange, they had a deep respect for anything that was old, and Judaism was far older than Rome itself. This antiquity gave it a certain gravitas and legal protection that most new cults didn't enjoy. The Romans officially recognized it as a religio licita, a legal religion, and generally allowed Jews to practice their faith without interference. But the core of Judaism was completely alien to the Roman mindset. While the Romans had a policy of the more gods, the merrier, the Jews insisted there was only one God, just one. This God, they claimed, was the creator of everything, and he was a jealous God who forbade the worship of any other deities. To a Roman, this sounded less like piety and more like profound rudeness to the other gods. It was seen as an antisocial and arrogant belief. Furthermore, this one God had a special, exclusive contract, a covenant with the Jewish people. They were his chosen people. This made them different from everyone else. They had their own strict laws, their own dietary rules, and their own customs that kept them separate from their Gentile or non-Jewish neighbors. They generally didn't participate in the public pagan festivals. They didn't eat with non-Jews, and they certainly wouldn't offer that simple pinch of incense to the emperor's spirit. They were, in the Roman view, a strange, insular, and often stubborn people. But because their religion was ancient, the Romans mostly just shrugged and left them alone, as long as they paid their taxes and didn't cause too much trouble. The problem was, in the first century, their homeland of Judea was causing a great deal of trouble.
The province of Judea in the early 1st century was a pressure cooker of religious and political tension. It had been under Roman control in one form or another for decades, and the Jewish population was deeply divided on how to deal with their new overlords. Some, like the priestly class known as the Sadducees, chose to collaborate with the Romans to maintain their own power and influence. Others, like the devoutly religious Pharisees, focused on a strict observance of Jewish law as a way of preserving their identity in a pagan world. And then there were the more radical groups, like the Zealots, who believed that a violent, armed rebellion was the only way to drive the Romans out and restore an independent Jewish kingdom. This political turmoil was supercharged by a powerful religious expectation. For centuries, the Jewish prophets had spoken of a coming figure, the Mashiach, or Messiah. This Messiah, it was widely believed, would be a great warrior king, a new King David, who would be sent by God to destroy Israel's enemies, cast out the foreign invaders, and establish a glorious new kingdom on earth. In the tense and resentful atmosphere of Roman-occupied Judea, messianic expectation was at a fever pitch. The countryside was filled with charismatic preachers, self-proclaimed prophets, and potential messiahs, each gathering their own following. Many of them preached an apocalyptic message. The world as they knew it was corrupt and evil, and God was about to intervene in a dramatic, violent way to destroy the wicked and reward the righteous. The end was nigh. It was into this chaotic, hopeful, and deeply paranoid world that a young itinerant preacher from the backwater region of Galilee, a man named Jesus of Nazareth, emerged and began to gather his own disciples. From a purely historical Roman perspective, Jesus of Nazareth was, at first glance, not particularly remarkable. He was one of many such figures who were active in Judea at the time. He was a Jewish, Aramaic-speaking artisan from a small village who, in the last few years of his life, became a traveling teacher and healer. He gathered a small band of followers, mostly fishermen and other common folk, and traveled through the Galilean countryside, preaching his message. His message was a radical reinterpretation of Jewish law and tradition. He spoke of the imminent arrival of the kingdom of God, a concept that was both spiritually and politically explosive. To his followers, this kingdom was a new world order where the poor would be blessed, the meek would inherit the earth, and the righteous would be rewarded. To his enemies, and more importantly to the Roman authorities, talk of a new kingdom sounded a lot like sedition. It sounded like a challenge to the existing kingdom, the one run by Caesar. He taught in parables, he was said to have performed miracles, and he developed a reputation as a charismatic leader who spoke with a unique authority. His teachings emphasized love, forgiveness, and a radical kind of social justice that was often critical of the wealthy and the powerful. He eventually made his way to the center of Jewish life, the city of Jerusalem, during the festival of Passover, a time of high religious fervor and massive crowds. It was here that his popularity among the common people and his conflict with the temple authorities reached a breaking point. The local priestly class, fearing that he might incite a riot and bring down the wrath of the Romans, decided he was a threat that needed to be neutralized.
The death of Jesus, which would become the central event of the new religion, was, from the Roman point of view, a routine and unremarkable piece of provincial administration. The Jewish temple authorities, led by the high priest Caiaphas, arrested Jesus. They considered his teachings to be blasphemous and a threat to their own authority. But under Roman law, they did not have the power to execute him. For that, they needed the Roman governor. So they handed him over to the man in charge, the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. The charge they presented to Pilate was not blasphemy, a crime the Romans couldn't have cared less about. The charge was sedition. They accused Jesus of claiming to be the King of the Jews. For a Roman governor, this was a simple, open and shut case. Anyone who claimed to be a king in Roman territory was, by definition, a rebel, a threat to the authority of the emperor. The punishment for such a crime was automatic and non-negotiable: death. Pilate, according to the gospel accounts, may have been personally reluctant, but politically, his hands were tied. He did what any Roman governor would do when faced with a potential political agitator during a tense religious festival. He decided to make an example of him. He had Jesus scourged and then ordered him to be executed in the standard Roman way for non-citizen criminals and rebels: crucifixion. To the Romans, the crucifixion of Jesus was a minor piece of administrative housekeeping, the squashing of a potential local troublemaker. The cross was not a symbol of salvation. It was a brutal instrument of state terror, a public message that this is what happens to those who challenge the power of Rome.
With the death of their leader, the movement around Jesus should have collapsed. This is what usually happened. A charismatic preacher would arise, gather a following, get arrested and executed by the Romans, and his disappointed followers would simply melt back into the countryside. And for a few days, it seemed this is exactly what would happen. The followers of Jesus, a small group of terrified men and women, scattered and went into hiding, their hopes shattered. Their chosen Messiah had been humiliated and killed in the most shameful way imaginable. The story was over. Except it wasn't. A few days later, something happened that changed everything. The followers of Jesus, starting with a group of women led by Mary Magdalene, began to claim that they had seen him alive again. They claimed that his tomb was empty and that he had appeared to them, resurrected from the dead. This was the radical, explosive, and completely unbelievable claim upon which the entire Christian faith would be built. This was not a simple resuscitation. They were not claiming that he had just been unconscious. They were claiming that he had truly died and had been brought back to life by the power of God as the first taste of a coming new creation. This one extraordinary belief transformed the group. Their despair turned to a zealous, unshakable conviction. Their executed leader was not a failed Messiah. He was a victorious divine being who had conquered death itself. This belief gave them a new and powerful message and a renewed sense of purpose. They regrouped in Jerusalem, no longer hiding in fear, but ready to start spreading the news, the evangelion, or good news about what they had witnessed. The movement had been, quite literally, resurrected.
In its very first years, the Christian movement was not a new religion. It was a sect within Judaism. The first followers of Jesus, led by his brother James and his chief disciple, Peter, were all devout, Aramaic-speaking Jews. They continued to worship at the temple in Jerusalem, they continued to follow Jewish dietary laws, and they continued to observe the Sabbath. Their one single distinguishing belief was that the long-awaited Jewish Messiah had finally come, and his name was Jesus of Nazareth. Their initial mission, therefore, was not to the outside world. It was to their own people. They preached in the synagogues and in the streets of Jerusalem, trying to convince their fellow Jews that Jesus was the fulfillment of the prophecies in the Hebrew Scriptures. They argued that his death and resurrection had been part of God's divine plan all along, a new covenant with the people of Israel. They were not trying to create a new religion called Christianity. They were trying to convince Judaism that its ultimate purpose had been fulfilled. This early group, sometimes called the Jerusalem Church, was the original core of the movement. But their message was not widely accepted. For most Jews, the idea that the Messiah would be a humble preacher who would be shamefully executed by their enemies was a contradiction in terms. They were waiting for a powerful king, a victorious general, not a crucified carpenter. While the Jerusalem church gained some converts, it remained a small, and to many, heretical minority sect within the broader world of first-century Judaism. For the movement to become a world religion, it would need a new and much more radical vision. And that vision would come from the one man who was, at the time, its greatest and most zealous enemy.
Enter Saul of Tarsus. If the Jerusalem apostles like Peter and James were the quiet, traditionalist founders of the movement, Saul was the disruptive, visionary CEO who would eventually take the company global. But he started out on the other side of the aisle. Saul was a highly educated, Greek-speaking Jew from a cosmopolitan city in southern Turkey. He was also a Pharisee, a member of a devout and strict Jewish sect that was deeply committed to the observance of Jewish law. And he was, by his own account, a fanatic. He saw this new sect of Nazarenes as a dangerous heresy, a threat to the purity of the Jewish faith. Saul believed that the claims these Christians were making, that a crucified man was the Messiah, were a blasphemy of the highest order. He saw it as his sacred duty to stamp out this new and dangerous movement. He became a persecutor. The book of Acts describes him as breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He was present at the stoning of the first Christian martyr, Stephen, and he went from synagogue to synagogue, dragging out Christian converts, both men and women, and having them imprisoned. He was, in short, the most energetic and feared opponent of the early church. He was a man of intense, burning conviction, a brilliant and educated mind who was using all of his talents to try and destroy this new faith before it could spread. In his own mind, he was not a villain. He was a hero, a defender of the one true God against a blasphemous cult. He received official letters from the high priest in Jerusalem, authorizing him to travel to the city of Damascus to hunt down the Christian converts who had fled there. And so, Saul set out on the road to Damascus, fully intending to continue his holy war.
The story of what happened next on the road to Damascus is one of the most famous and consequential conversion stories in all of human history. As Saul and his companions were traveling, a brilliant light, brighter than the midday sun, suddenly flashed down from the sky, enveloping them. Saul was thrown to the ground. Then a voice spoke to him, a voice that only he could understand. It said, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Saul, terrified, asked, "Who are you, Lord?" And the voice replied, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." The experience was transformative. Saul was left blinded, and his companions had to lead him by the hand into the city of Damascus. For 3 days he remained in darkness, neither eating nor drinking, contemplating the meaning of his incredible vision. He had come to Damascus as the church's greatest enemy, convinced he was doing God's work. Now, he believed he had come face to face with the very divine being he had been persecuting. He was visited by a local Christian disciple named Ananias, who, after some understandable hesitation, laid his hands on Saul. According to the story, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes and his sight was restored. He was then baptized, becoming a follower of the very faith he had dedicated his life to destroying. Saul of Tarsus, the great persecutor, was gone. He would from now on be known by his Roman name, Paul. And Paul, the newly converted apostle, would take the intense, burning conviction he had once used to attack the church and turn it to a new purpose, spreading its message to the entire world.
After his dramatic conversion, Paul spent some time in seclusion, reevaluating his entire understanding of his faith. And he emerged with a theological vision that was as brilliant as it was radical, an idea that would cause a major conflict with the original apostles back in Jerusalem. Paul's great insight was this: if Jesus was not just the Jewish Messiah, but a divine being who had died and been resurrected for the salvation of all of humanity, then his message could not be confined to just the Jewish people. It had to be for everyone. This was a revolutionary idea. The Jerusalem church, under Peter and James, was still operating as a Jewish sect. They largely believed that for a non-Jew, a Gentile, to become a follower of Jesus, they first had to, in essence, become a Jew. This meant the men had to be circumcised, and all followers had to adhere to the strict Jewish dietary laws and other rituals. This was a huge barrier to entry for any potential non-Jewish converts. Who would want to sign up for a new religion if it required a painful surgical procedure and a complete change in lifestyle? Paul argued that this was all wrong. He claimed that salvation came through faith in Jesus Christ alone, not through adherence to the old Jewish laws. He argued that circumcision was unnecessary and that dietary laws no longer applied. This was his great theological breakthrough: the creation of a universal religion open to anyone, Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free, on the basis of faith alone. This idea, however, caused a huge fight. Paul had to travel to Jerusalem to debate the issue with Peter and James in what is now known as the Council of Jerusalem. After a tense argument, they reached a compromise, agreeing that Paul could pursue his mission to the Gentiles as long as he didn't forget the poor in Jerusalem. The door was now open.
This decision to take the message of Christianity to the non-Jewish world was the single most important moment in the religion's history. It was the strategic decision that allowed a small, obscure, Jewish messianic sect to become a global religion. It was the moment the startup decided to pivot from its niche domestic market and attempt to conquer the entire world. And its chief evangelist, its global marketing director, was the Apostle Paul. For the next several decades, Paul crisscrossed the Roman Empire, traveling through modern-day Turkey, Greece, and all the way to Rome itself, preaching his new, universal version of the faith. He was a tireless and brilliant missionary. Being a Roman citizen, he could travel freely on the empire's magnificent road network. Being a fluent Greek speaker, he could communicate with people all across the eastern half of the empire, as Greek was the common language of commerce and culture. He would travel to a major city like Ephesus or Corinth, go to the local synagogue first, and then, after usually being rejected there, he would take his message to the public marketplace, to the Gentiles. He would establish small communities of believers known as ecclesia, or churches, and then move on to the next city,
keeping in touch with his new converts through a series of remarkable letters, which make up a large portion of the New Testament. It was Paul who, more than anyone, took the raw material of the Jesus movement and shaped it into a coherent, portable, and incredibly appealing theology for a non-Jewish audience. He was the one who laid the groundwork for its slow, steady, and seemingly impossible growth throughout the Roman world.
So, how did this new faith actually spread? Paul and the other apostles didn't have access to the internet or social media. They had something almost as good: the Roman Empire itself. The very empire that would one day try to destroy Christianity was, ironically, the perfect incubator for its growth. The key was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the first time in history, the entire Mediterranean world was unified under a single government. There were no borders to cross, no pirates on the sea, for the most part, and no bandits on the roads. The Romans were brilliant engineers, and they had built an incredible network of famously straight, well-maintained roads that connected every corner of their vast empire. These roads were the arteries of commerce, of government, and now of religion. Christian missionaries like the Apostle Paul could travel with relative ease and safety from a city in Syria, across Anatolia, through Greece, and all the way to Rome, carrying their message with them. The universal languages of the empire, Latin in the West and Greek in the East, meant they could be understood wherever they went. Christianity in its early centuries was an almost exclusively urban phenomenon. Missionaries focused their efforts on the big, bustling, multicultural cities of the empire, places like Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Carthage, and Rome itself. The countryside remained, for the most part, deeply traditional and pagan. The word pagan, in fact, comes from the Latin paganus, which originally meant country dweller. The new faith took root not in the sleepy villages, but in the crowded, anonymous, and often chaotic apartment blocks, the insulae of the great Roman cities. It was a religion perfectly suited for the new, globalized world that Rome had created.
But what made people in these cities actually want to convert? Was it just the promise of salvation in the next life? That was part of it for sure. But for many, the primary attraction of Christianity was something much more immediate and tangible: its community. The early Christian community, the ecclesia, was a new and radical kind of social group. In a world that was often brutal, anonymous, and deeply stratified, the church offered a new kind of family. When you were baptized, you didn't just join a religion, you were adopted into a brotherhood and sisterhood. Christians referred to each other as brother and sister, and they took these terms seriously. They were expected to care for one another, to support each other, and to love one another. This was not just a nice idea, it was a practical, daily reality. The early churches held communal meals, the love feasts, or agape, where rich and poor would eat together as equals. More importantly, the church created what was, in effect, the ancient world's first private social safety net. Each local church would collect funds from its members, and these funds were used to support the most vulnerable people in their community. They provided food for the hungry, shelter for the homeless, and support for the widows and orphans. They would even raise money to buy the freedom of fellow Christians who were slaves, or to provide support to those who had been imprisoned for their faith. In a world with no government welfare programs, this level of practical, organized charity was a revolutionary act, and it was an incredibly powerful advertisement for the new faith.
The power of this Christian charity was never more evident than during the devastating plagues that periodically swept through the Roman Empire. These epidemics, likely smallpox or measles, would kill a huge percentage of the population. The standard pagan reaction to a plague was driven by fear and self-preservation. Doctors would flee the cities. People would abandon their own sick family members, casting them out into the streets to die, terrified of catching the disease themselves. The historian Thucydides, writing A Plague in Ancient Athens, described this breakdown of all social bonds as one of the most terrible consequences of the disease. The Christians, however, reacted in a completely different way.
Their belief in a loving God and the promise of a blessed afterlife made them much less fearful of death. While the pagans were fleeing, Christian communities stayed put and actively cared for their sick. They would bring food and water not just to their own members, but to their sick pagan neighbors as well. They offered care and comfort to the dying, and they ensured that the dead received a proper burial. This had two profound effects. First, this basic nursing care, simply providing food, water, and a clean bed, dramatically increased the survival rate among those who were cared for. Christian communities had a much higher survival rate during plagues than the general population. Second, their incredible countercultural altruism was a stunningly effective form of evangelism. Pagans who were abandoned by their own families and then nursed back to health by Christians were, not surprisingly, often deeply moved by the experience. Many of them converted, convinced that the God who inspired such selfless love must be the true God.
Another key to Christianity's remarkable growth was its powerful appeal to women. Roman society, like most ancient societies, was intensely patriarchal. A woman, particularly an upper-class woman, lived her entire life under the legal authority of a man, first her father, the paterfamilias, and then her husband. Her value was primarily seen in her ability to produce legitimate children and to manage the household. While many women certainly led fulfilling lives, the system was, by its nature, restrictive. Christianity offered a radical new vision of female dignity and purpose. Within the community of the church, women were considered the spiritual equals of men. They were all one in Christ Jesus, as the Apostle Paul wrote. This was a profound departure from the hierarchical pagan world. The new faith also championed a code of conduct that was deeply appealing to women. It valued marital fidelity and condemned the common pagan practices of divorce for trivial reasons, the sexual exploitation of female slaves, and perhaps most importantly, the practice of infanticide. It was common practice for a Roman father to expose an unwanted infant, leaving it to die. And because boys were more highly valued, this was most often the fate of newborn girls. Christianity strictly forbade this practice, valuing the lives of girls as much as boys. Furthermore, the church offered respectable and powerful roles for women outside of marriage. The consecrated virgin and the chaste widow became figures of high honor within the community. A wealthy widow, instead of being forced to remarry, could choose to remain single and use her wealth and influence as a great patroness of the church. Women like this would often host the local house church in their villas, becoming the respected leaders of their communities. For many women, the church offered a level of agency, dignity, and influence that was simply unavailable in the broader Roman world.
Just as it appealed to women, the Christian message had a powerful and obvious appeal to the vast population of slaves and the poor, who made up the majority of the Roman Empire's population. The core of Jesus' teachings, as recorded in the Gospels, was a message of hope for the downtrodden. "Blessed are you who are poor," he says in the Gospel of Luke, "for yours is the kingdom of God." This was a revolutionary and deeply subversive message. The Roman world was built on a rigid social hierarchy. The gods themselves were seen as upholding this order. The emperor, the senators, the wealthy, they were at the top because they were favored by the gods. The poor and the enslaved were at the bottom because that was their fate. Christianity turned this entire worldview on its head. It preached that God's love was not for the rich and powerful, but for the humble, the meek, and the oppressed. It promised that in the coming kingdom of God, the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. This did not mean that the early church was an abolitionist movement. Paul, in his letters, instructs slaves to obey their earthly masters. But it did mean that within the community of the church, the social hierarchy was, in theory, erased. A slave and his master might attend a house church, share the same communal meal, and call each other brother. They were both considered equal in the eyes of God. For a person who was legally considered to be property, a talking tool, This message of inherent spiritual dignity was an idea of almost unimaginable power. It offered a hope and a sense of self-worth that their society had systematically denied them.
As this new religion began to grow and attract followers, it also started to attract suspicion and hostility from the Roman authorities and the general pagan population. And the first and most fundamental accusation leveled against the Christians was a strange one. They were accused of atheism. This sounds bizarre to us today, as we think of Christians as the quintessential believers in God. But from a Roman perspective, it made perfect sense. The Romans were polytheists. They believed in thousands of gods. There were the great gods of Olympus, the local gods of the provinces, the household spirits, the demigods and heroes. A pious Roman was expected to honor all of them. The system was additive. When the Romans encountered a new god, like Isis from Egypt, their general attitude was, "Welcome to the party. We'll build you a temple." The Christians, however, were exclusive. They insisted that their God was the only God, and that all the other gods of the Roman pantheon were either false idols or, even worse, evil demons. This was seen as not just strange, but deeply insulting and dangerous. By refusing to honor the traditional gods who had made Rome great, the Christians were, in the Roman view, atheists. They were denying the very existence of the gods that protected the state. And because the safety of the state depended on the pax deorum, this made the Christians a threat to the entire community. If a plague struck or a barbarian army invaded, it was easy to point the finger at the atheistic Christians whose impiety had surely angered the gods and brought this disaster upon everyone. It was this charge of atheism that would provide the intellectual justification for the first waves of persecution.
From the charge of atheism, a host of even darker and more sensational rumors began to spread among the pagan population, fueled by the secrecy of Christian practices. Because the Christians met in private homes and because their central rituals were hidden from outsiders, a suspicious and hostile public began to imagine the worst. Two of the most common and persistent accusations were about their secret feasts and their close-knit community. The first major misunderstanding stemmed from the Christian central ritual, the Eucharist. Christians would speak of gathering to share in the body and blood of their Savior. To an outsider unfamiliar with the deep spiritual meaning of this act, this symbolic language was twisted into wild accusations of dark and forbidden ceremonies taking place behind closed doors. Shocking and entirely untrue stories were told about their secret rites to paint them in the worst possible light. The second misunderstanding arose from their unique social language. Christians referred to each other as brother and sister to signify their spiritual family, and they held regular communal meals which they called love feasts. To a suspicious Roman ear, a secret society where brothers and sisters gathered at night for love feasts was misinterpreted, leading to rumors that their meetings were immoral and defied all traditional Roman values. These rumors, as baseless as they were, painted a picture of Christians as a strange and dangerous cult, a group that seemed to reject not just the gods, but the most fundamental rules of a decent society.
So where did these early Christians actually meet to perform these misunderstood rituals? For the first 2 centuries of the church's existence, there were no dedicated church buildings. The idea of a grand basilica with a steeple and a cross was a long way in the future. The early Christian community was a network of what we now call house churches, or in Latin, domus ecclesiae. The community in a city would be too large to meet in one place, so it would be divided into a number of smaller groups, each of which would meet in the private home of one of its wealthier members. A well-to-do convert, a merchant, or a patroness would offer their large Roman domus as the weekly gathering place for their local cell. The service would take place in the largest room of the house, usually the atrium or the triclinium, the dining room. These meetings were held discreetly, often before dawn on Sunday, the first day of the week, in honor of the resurrection. The members would gather, greet each other with a holy kiss, and the service would begin. It was simple compared to later Catholic Mass. It would involve readings from the Hebrew Scriptures and from the letters of the apostles, like Paul, which were being copied and circulated among the communities. There would be a talk or sermon from one of the elders or presbyters. They would sing hymns, say prayers together, and the meeting would culminate in the sharing of the Eucharist, the blessed bread and wine. After the formal service, they would often share a communal meal, the agape, reinforcing their bonds as a community before quietly dispersing back into the city for the start of the working day.
How did this scattered network of secret house churches manage to grow into a powerful international institution? The key was its remarkable and resilient organizational structure. While the movement was decentralized in practice, it was unified by a shared set of beliefs and a surprisingly consistent leadership model that was replicated in every city where the faith took root. At the head of the Christian community in each city was the episkopos, or bishop. The word literally means overseer. The bishop was the chief administrator, the head pastor, and the primary teacher for all the Christians in his city. He was seen as a successor to the apostles, the guardian of the correct teachings of the faith against the various heresies that were constantly popping up. A powerful and charismatic bishop could grow his city's church from a few dozen members to several thousand in his lifetime. Assisting the bishop were the presbyteroi, or presbyters. The word means elders. These were the men who would lead the worship in the individual house churches, acting as the local priests. They were responsible for teaching, preaching, and administering the sacraments, like baptism and the Eucharist. And supporting both the bishop and the presbyters were the diakonoi, or deacons. The deacons were the social workers and financial managers of the early church. They were responsible for managing the church's charitable funds, distributing food to the poor, caring for the widows and orphans, and visiting the sick. This three-tiered structure, bishop, presbyters, and deacons, proved to be incredibly effective. It provided clear leadership, pastoral care, and practical social services. It was this robust organizational framework that allowed the church to grow, to weather the storms of persecution, and to manage an increasingly large and complex community.
The final piece of the puzzle that allowed this collection of scattered communities to feel like a single, unified entity was a technology that the Romans had perfected: the letter. The early Christian movement was held together by a vast and vibrant network of correspondence. It all began with the apostles themselves. As Paul traveled from city to city founding new churches, he would keep in touch with them through his letters. These were not just friendly hellos, they were detailed theological treatises, pastoral advice, and administrative instructions. A church in Corinth might be having a dispute about a certain doctrine. Paul would write them a letter to correct their thinking. A church in Thessalonica might be worried about what happens to people who die before Jesus returns. Paul would write to reassure them. These letters were so important that they would be carefully preserved, copied by hand, and circulated among the other churches, read aloud during their Sunday services. These circulating letters would eventually form the core of what we now know as the New Testament. This tradition of correspondence continued long after the apostles were gone. The bishops of the major cities, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, were in constant communication with each other. They would write letters to warn each other about new heresies, to ask for advice on disciplinary matters, to coordinate their charitable efforts, and to maintain a sense of a single, universal, or Catholic faith. The Roman road network carried not just soldiers and goods,
but the very ideas and instructions that were knitting the early Christian communities into a coherent and resilient international organization, a spiritual empire growing quietly in the shadow of the political one.
So we have this new Christian movement growing steadily in the cities of the empire. And for the most part, they were good neighbors. They took care of the poor, they nursed the sick, they valued family, and they preached a message of love and peace. So why did the Roman Empire, an institution that was generally quite tolerant of new religions, periodically decide that it needed to wipe them out? Why did this peaceful religion provoke such a violent and hostile reaction from the most powerful state on earth? The answer has very little to do with belief and everything to do with politics. The Romans, as we've seen, didn't really care what gods you worshipped in private, but they cared immensely about public loyalty. The problem with the Christians was not that they worshipped Jesus. The problem was that they only worshipped Jesus. Their exclusive monotheism meant they refused to participate in the public rituals that held Roman society together. Most critically, they refused to perform that simple token sacrifice to the emperor's spirit. To a Roman magistrate, this was not a matter of theological disagreement. It was an act of political defiance. It was like refusing to salute the flag or pay your taxes. It was seen as an expression of stubbornness or contumacia against the authority of the state. And because the emperor's cult was a universal symbol of loyalty, refusing to participate was seen as an act of treason or majestus. The Christians claimed they were loyal subjects of the emperor in all worldly matters, but the Romans didn't see the distinction. For them, religion and politics were the same thing. To refuse the gods of Rome was to refuse Rome itself, and that was a crime the state could not ignore.
For the first century or so after Jesus' death, the Roman state didn't have an official empire-wide policy on Christians. The persecutions were mostly local, sporadic, and often driven by mob violence rather than imperial edict. The first major state-sponsored persecution, and certainly the most famous, was not a matter of high policy at all. It was a cynical act of political opportunism by the Emperor Nero. In 64 AD, as we've discussed before, a massive fire devastated the city of Rome. Nero, who was already deeply unpopular, found himself facing angry rumors that he had started the fire himself to clear land for his new palace. Needing a scapegoat, and needing one fast, he chose the Christians. They were the perfect target. They were a small, secretive, and widely misunderstood group, already the subject of dark rumors about cannibalism and atheism. They were, in short, an easy group to blame because nobody liked them. The historian Tacitus, who was no friend to the Christians, describes the persecution that followed with a tone of pity. He reports that Nero didn't just execute them, he used them as a form of grotesque entertainment. Some were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were crucified. Most infamously, some were coated in pitch, tied to stakes in his private gardens, and set on fire to serve as human torches to illuminate his evening parties. It was an act of horrific cruelty. But it's important to remember that this persecution was localized to the city of Rome. It was not an empire-wide campaign to destroy the faith. It was just a tyrant using a despised minority to save his own skin. It would be another 2 centuries before the state decided to get serious about wiping out the Christians for good.
After the Neronian outburst, things settled down into a strange and precarious legal ambiguity for the next century and a half. What was the official policy on Christians? The best answer we have comes from a fascinating exchange of letters between the Emperor Trajan and a provincial governor named Pliny the Younger, around the year 112 AD. Pliny had been sent to govern the province of Bithynia in modern-day Turkey, and he found himself dealing with a problem he'd never encountered before: Christians. The superstition, as he called it, was spreading like a contagion through the cities and villages, and the pagan temples were becoming empty. He had started putting accused Christians on trial, and he wrote to the emperor to ask if he was doing it right, because he was a bit unsure of the protocol. His letter gives us a remarkable insight into the process. He would ask the accused 3 times if they were a Christian. If they said yes all 3 times and refused to recant, he would have them executed, not for any specific crime, but for what he called their pig-headed obstinacy. For those who denied being Christians, he made them prove it by offering incense and wine to a statue of Trajan and by cursing the name of Christ, something he had heard a true Christian would never do. Trajan's reply set the official policy for the empire for the next 150 years. He told Pliny that he had done the right thing, but he added 2 crucial qualifications. First, Christians were not to be actively hunted down. The state was not to waste its resources seeking them out. Second, anonymous accusations were to be ignored. There had to be a formal, public accuser. This created a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy. Being a Christian was a capital crime, but as long as you kept your head down and nobody officially accused you, you would probably be left alone.
This precarious peace was shattered in the middle of the 3rd century. The Roman Empire was in the midst of the Great Crisis, a 50-year period of civil war, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse. In times of profound crisis, people looked for someone to blame. And the Emperor Decius, who came to power in 249 AD, believed he knew the cause of all the empire's troubles. The people had abandoned the old gods, and the gods, in their anger, had abandoned Rome. He decided that the solution was to restore the Pax Deorum through a universal, empire-wide act of sacrifice. In 250 AD, Decius issued an edict that was a radical departure from previous policy. He ordered that every single inhabitant of the Roman Empire, man, woman, and child, had to perform a public sacrifice to the Roman gods in the presence of a local magistrate. This was not specifically aimed at Christians, but at everyone. It was a universal loyalty oath to the divine patrons of the state. Those who performed the sacrifice were given an official signed certificate called a libellus to prove they had complied. Dozens of these papyrus certificates have survived in the sands of Egypt. While the edict was universal, its primary target was, of course, the Christians, the only group who would refuse to comply. This was the first truly empire-wide, systematic persecution. The goal was not necessarily to kill the Christians, but to force them to recant. Decius wanted converts, not martyrs. The authorities were often instructed to imprison and torture Christians to get them to sacrifice, rather than executing them outright. For the first time, the entire machinery of the Roman state was mobilized to enforce religious conformity, and the Christian church was faced with its most severe test yet. The Edict of Decius created a profound crisis of conscience for the Christian community. Before, persecution had been a remote possibility for most. Now, it was an immediate and personal choice. What do you do when the local magistrate sets up an altar in your town square and orders you to come forward and prove your loyalty? Many Christians, faced with the stark choice between their faith and their life, chose to save themselves. They performed the sacrifice, whether it was dropping a pinch of incense or tasting the sacrificial meat. These people were known as the lapsi, or the lapsed, and they created a huge pastoral problem for the church after the persecution was over. Could they be forgiven and readmitted to the community? This question would cause major divisions and schisms within the church for decades to come. Other Christians found a middle ground. There was a thriving black market in forged labelli. You could bribe a corrupt magistrate or his clerk to issue you a certificate without you having to actually perform the sacrifice. This was seen by some as a clever way to survive without apostatizing, but to stricter Christians, it was still an act of cowardice. But a significant number of Christians, including many prominent bishops like Fabian of Rome, refused to comply. They openly defied the edict. For them, to sacrifice to the pagan gods was an act of idolatry, a betrayal of their one true God that would cost them their eternal salvation. These were the ones who were arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and, if they continued to refuse, executed. These were the confessores, those who confessed their faith, and the martyrs, those who died for it.
The persecution under Decius was short-lived, as he was killed in battle after just 2 years. But a few years later, in 257 AD, the Emperor Valerian initiated a new persecution, this time with a more targeted and strategic approach. Valerian and his advisors seem to have understood that the strength of the Christian church lay in its leadership and its strong community structure. Instead of trying to force every single Christian to sacrifice, he decided to try and cut the head off the snake. His first edict ordered that all Christian clergy, bishops, presbyters, and deacons were to be arrested and forced to sacrifice to the Roman gods. He also forbade any Christians from assembling for worship or visiting their cemeteries, an attempt to break up their community gatherings. His second edict, a year later, was even more severe. It decreed that bishops and priests who refused to sacrifice were to be executed immediately. Furthermore, he went after the wealthy, high-status members of the church. Christian senators and equestrians were to be stripped of their rank and their property. If they still refused to abandon their faith, they too were to be executed. This was a direct assault on the church's leadership and its financial resources. The goal was to leave the Christian community as a leaderless, impoverished flock that would, he hoped, simply wither away. This persecution led to the deaths of many prominent church leaders, including Bishop Cyprian of Carthage, whose calm and dignified martyrdom was recorded in detail and became a source of inspiration for Christians across the empire. The final, longest, and most brutal attempt by the Roman state to eradicate Christianity came at the beginning of the 4th century. This was the Great Persecution, initiated by the Emperor Diocletian and his colleagues in the Tetrarchy, beginning in 303 AD. Diocletian was a great reformer who had pulled the empire back from the brink of collapse. He was a conservative traditionalist who believed that the restoration of the old Roman virtues and the old Roman gods was essential for the health of the state. And he came to see the highly organized, rapidly growing Christian church as a state within a state, a threat to his vision of a unified and disciplined empire. The persecution began with a series of edicts. The first one was aimed at the church's infrastructure. It ordered that all church buildings were to be demolished, and all copies of the Christian scriptures were to be seized and burned. Christian clergy were arrested. Wealthy Christians were stripped of their rank. This was an attempt to wipe out the institutional memory and physical presence of the church. A later edict, issued during a time of political unrest, required everyone, once again, to perform a public sacrifice. The intensity of the Great Persecution varied across the empire. In the West, under the Caesar Constantius, the father of the future Constantine, it was relatively mild. But in the East, under Diocletian and his Caesar, Galerius, it was a systematic and brutal campaign of terror that lasted for nearly a decade. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in horrific ways. Some were burned alive,
some were thrown to the beasts, and in Egypt, the authorities resorted to new and gruesome forms of execution. This was the Roman state's last and most determined attempt to destroy the Christian faith by force, but it would prove to be a catastrophic failure.
What was it actually like in those moments to be a martyr? Thanks to a number of surviving martyr acts, the transcripts of their trials, and the accounts written by fellow Christians, we have a remarkable window into the psychology and experience of these individuals. Far from being a terrifying ordeal, for the most devout, martyrdom was seen as the ultimate victory, a glorious and joyful consummation of their faith. The experience often began with an arrest and an appearance before the Roman governor. The trials were public spectacles. The governor would sit on his tribunal, and the accused Christian would be brought before him. The exchange was often a strange dialogue of two people talking past each other. The governor, a practical Roman administrator, would be exasperated. He would try to reason with the Christian. "Just offer the sacrifice," he might say. "It's just a pinch of incense. You don't have to believe it, just do it, and you can go home to your family." He saw it as a simple matter of public order. But for the Christian, it was a profound test of faith. They saw the trial not as a legal proceeding, but as a spiritual battle. They believed that Christ himself was present with them, giving them the strength to confess their faith. One of the most famous accounts is that of Perpetua, a young noblewoman from Carthage. In her prison diary, she describes her visions and dreams, which filled her with a sense of divine purpose. She writes of walking into the arena not with fear, but with a radiant and joyful expression, as if she were walking into paradise. This mindset, this belief that they were already victorious over death, is what allowed them to face the most horrific tortures with a calm and courage that often stunned their pagan executioners.
The Roman state had all the power. It had the legions, the courts, the prisons, and the arenas. The Christians had nothing but their faith. So why did the persecutions fail so spectacularly? The answer lies in the strange, counterintuitive power of martyrdom. The Roman authorities intended the public execution of Christians to be a terrifying deterrent, a warning to others to abandon this dangerous superstition. But more often than not, it had the exact opposite effect. The spectacle of a martyr's death was a powerful piece of theater. Imagine a pagan citizen in the crowd at the amphitheater. He has come to watch the midday executions. He sees a young woman, like Perpetua, or an old bishop, like Polycarp, brought out into the arena. He expects them to weep and beg for their lives, but instead they face the wild animals or the executioner's sword with a strange, serene courage, sometimes even singing hymns or praying for their persecutors. This was deeply unsettling to the Roman mind. It was a demonstration of a moral courage and a conviction that was completely alien to their own experience. The Christian writer Tertullian famously taunted the Roman governors. "The more you mow us down, the more we grow," he wrote. "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." And he was right. A courageous death could be a more powerful sermon than any spoken word. The pagan onlookers might not have understood the Christian theology, but they could understand courage. The spectacle of martyrdom often inspired not fear, but admiration, and a deep curiosity about the faith that could inspire such devotion. It was the Church's most powerful, if most tragic, form of public relations. After nearly a decade of the most intense and widespread persecution in Roman history, the Great Persecution finally came to an end, not with a Christian victory, but with an admission of failure by the Roman state itself. By 311 AD, the Emperor Diocletian had retired. The main driver of the persecution in the East was now his successor, Galerius. Galerius had been a zealous persecutor, but now he was old and dying of a gruesome disease that was, according to the Christian writers, eating him alive. On his deathbed, Galerius seems to have had a change of heart, or at least a pragmatic realization that his policy had been a catastrophic failure.
The persecution had not destroyed the church, it had only made it stronger and more defiant. So, in April of 311 AD, he issued an official edict of toleration from his palace in Nicomedia. The edict is a remarkable document. He begins by stating his goal had been to recall the Christians to the religion of their ancestors, but that most of them had stubbornly refused. Therefore, he writes, in an act of imperial clemency, he has decided to grant them the right to exist again. Christians were now permitted to re-establish their churches and to worship their own God on one condition, that they do nothing to disturb public order. And then, in the final, stunning line of the edict, the dying persecutor makes an incredible request. He asks the Christians to pray to their God for our well-being and for that of the state. The man who had spent years trying to destroy Christianity was now asking for its prayers. The longest and darkest night of the church was over. The persecution had officially failed, and the stage was now set for an even more dramatic and even more improbable reversal of fortune.
The great persecution was over. Galerius's edict of toleration in 311 AD meant that Christians across the empire could, for the first time in a decade, emerge from the shadows, rebuild their churches, and worship without fear. For the exhausted Christian community, this must have felt like the final victory. But mere tolerance was not the end of the story. It was just the prelude to something far more dramatic. In the chaotic, multiplayer Game of Thrones that was the collapsing tetrarchy, a new and ambitious figure was rising in the West. A man who would not just tolerate the Christian God, but would claim him as his own personal patron and ride that patronage to ultimate victory. His name was Constantine. Constantine was the son of Constantius, the tolerant Western Caesar who had largely ignored the persecution edicts in his territory of Gaul and Britain. When his father died in York in 306 AD, Constantine's troops hailed him as the new emperor in a direct challenge to the carefully planned succession of the Tetrarchy. This act kicked off another round of brutal and complex civil wars, with multiple emperors, or Augusti, and junior emperors, or Caesars, all vying for supreme power. Constantine was a brilliant general, a ruthless politician, and a man with an almost messianic belief in his own destiny. For years, he fought to consolidate his power in the western provinces. By 312 AD, he was ready for his masterstroke. He decided to march on Italy to eliminate his chief rival in the west, an emperor named Maxentius, who controlled the city of Rome. It was a huge gamble. Maxentius had a larger army and the powerful defensive walls of the capital. Constantine was marching into the heart of his enemy's territory, but he was marching with a newfound sense of confidence. On the eve of the decisive battle, just outside the city of Rome, Constantine allegedly had an experience that would not just win him a battle, but would change the course of human history.
The story of Constantine's vision is one of the most famous and consequential tales in all of Western history. It is a moment where the line between history, legend, and propaganda becomes hopelessly blurred. According to the Christian historian Eusebius, who wrote about it years later, on the day before the battle, Constantine and his army saw a miraculous sign in the sky. Above the sun, there appeared a cross of light, and with it, the Greek words "en touto nika," which translates to "in this sign, conquer." The vision, understandably, left Constantine puzzled. That night, he had a dream in which Christ appeared to him and commanded him to make a replica of the sign he had seen in the heavens and to use it as his standard in battle. This symbol was the Chi Rho, a monogram formed by combining the first two Greek letters of the name Christ. The next morning, Constantine ordered his craftsmen to create a new standard, the labarum, a long spear with a crossbar from which hung a banner decorated with the Chi Rho symbol. He also had his soldiers paint the symbol on their shields. The next day, Constantine's smaller army, fighting under this strange new Christian emblem, won a stunning and decisive victory against the forces of Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Maxentius's army was routed,
and he himself, while trying to flee back across the Tiber River, was pushed into the water by his own retreating soldiers and drowned. Constantine entered Rome as the sole and undisputed ruler of the Western Roman Empire. Was it a genuine miracle, a divinely inspired vision, or was it a shrewd psychological ploy by a brilliant general to inspire his troops and perhaps win the support of the Christian minority in Rome? We can never know, but what matters is that Constantine believed it. From that day forward, he considered himself to be an instrument of the Christian God.
After his victory, Constantine didn't just tolerate Christianity. He began to actively and lavishly favor it. In 313 AD, he met with his co-emperor in the east, Licinius, and together they issued the so-called Edict of Milan. This was not, as is often believed, an edict that made Christianity the official religion. It was an edict of universal religious tolerance. It decreed that all people in the empire, whether Christian or pagan, were free to worship whichever deity they chose. It officially ended all persecution and restored all confiscated property, churches, cemeteries, and funds back to the Christian communities. But Constantine's personal actions went far beyond mere tolerance. He began to shower the church with imperial patronage. He declared Sunday, the Christian day of worship, a public holiday. He granted legal privileges to the clergy, exempting them from taxes and civic duties. Most importantly, he began to use the vast resources of the imperial treasury to fund the construction of magnificent new church buildings known as basilicas. In Rome, he commissioned the construction of the original St. Peter's Basilica, built over the traditional site of St. Peter's tomb, and the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran, which became the official cathedral of the city of Rome. He sent his mother, Helena, to the Holy Land, where she discovered the true cross and other holy sites, and he funded the construction of grand churches on those spots, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. He was transforming Christianity from a religion of secret house meetings into a grand, public, and imperial faith with buildings that could rival and even surpass the old pagan temples.
This sudden flood of imperial money and favor had a profound and transformative effect on the church itself. For 3 centuries, Christianity had been a religion of the poor, the marginalized, and the persecuted. Its leaders were humble bishops, its meeting places were private homes, and its greatest honor was martyrdom. Now, almost overnight, everything changed. Being a Christian was no longer dangerous, it was fashionable. It was the religion of the emperor, and it was a path to social and political advancement. This led to a massive influx of new converts, but many of them were rice Christians, people who joined the church not out of deep spiritual conviction, but for the worldly benefits it now offered. The church, which had once been a small, close-knit community of true believers, was now becoming a vast, popular institution filled with people of varying levels of commitment. The character of the church's leadership also changed dramatically. The humble bishop, who was once a prime target for execution, now became a powerful and influential figure in the city. Bishops were now major landowners. They controlled huge charitable funds, and they were often called upon to act as judges and advisors in the imperial administration. They became, in effect, grand princes of the church. This new wealth and power also led to new problems. Contested elections for the position of bishop in a major city could now turn into violent, bloody affairs as rival factions fought for control of the prestigious and lucrative office. The church had won its long battle for survival, but it now faced a new and more insidious danger: the corrupting influence of worldly power.
Constantine's patronage also came with a significant catch. If the Christian God was his personal patron deity, the one who granted him victory in battle, then Constantine expected the Christian church to be unified and orderly. He had not signed up to be the patron of a bickering, divided, and chaotic organization. But the church, which had been a decentralized network of communities for centuries, was anything but unified. It was rife with theological disagreements and rival factions. And as soon as the persecutions ended, these disagreements exploded into the open. The biggest and most bitter of these disputes was the Arian controversy. A priest from Alexandria named Arius began teaching what he believed to be a more rational understanding of the nature of Christ. He argued that if God the Father had created everything, then he must have also created the Son. This meant that the Son, Jesus, was a divine being, but he was a created being. He was not eternal and not co-equal with the Father. He was, in a sense, a lesser, subordinate deity. To his opponent, the Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, this was a monstrous heresy. Athanasius argued that the Son was co-eternal and consubstantial with the Father, begotten, not made. The debate was subtle, theological, and incredibly technical, but it was also a matter of life and death salvation, and it tore the eastern half of the empire apart. Churches were divided, bishops excommunicated each other, and riots broke out in the streets. Constantine, a new convert with a soldier's understanding of theology, was horrified. He saw this disunity as a threat to the stability of his empire, and he decided, as the emperor, that it was his job to fix it. To solve the Arian crisis, Constantine did something no one had ever done before. In 325 AD, he summoned the first ever ecumenical, or worldwide council of the church. He invited every bishop from across the entire Roman Empire to gather in the city of Nicaea, in modern-day Turkey, to settle this theological dispute once and for all. He even offered to pay for their travel expenses from the state treasury. The Council of Nicaea was a remarkable and unprecedented event. Over 300 bishops arrived from every corner of the empire. Many of them were old men who still bore the physical scars of the recent great persecution. They had been imprisoned, tortured, and had seen their friends executed. Now, they were being welcomed as honored guests of the Roman emperor himself, who presided over the opening of the council. It was a stunning demonstration of the church's new status. The theological debate was long and fierce, but Constantine, who was more interested in unity than in theological nuance, pushed the bishops to reach a consensus. The result of the council was the formulation of the Nicene Creed, a formal statement of faith that decisively rejected Arianism and affirmed the orthodox position that the Son was of one substance with the Father. The Creed, with a few later modifications, would go on to become the foundational and most widely accepted statement of belief in all of Christian history. The Council of Nicaea was a landmark moment. It was the beginning of a unified, orthodox Christian doctrine. But it was also the beginning of a new and often troubled relationship, where the power of the Roman state would be used to enforce that doctrine and to punish those who were now deemed heretics.
After Constantine's death, the triumph of Christianity seemed assured. His sons continued his pro-Christian policies, and the old pagan traditions continued to fade into the background. But the story has one last, surprising twist. There was one final, brief, and intellectually brilliant attempt to turn back the clock and restore the old gods. This was the reign of Constantine's nephew, Julian, who would go down in Christian history with the unflattering nickname Julian the Apostate. Julian had grown up in a dangerous and violent world. Most of his family had been murdered by the sons of Constantine in a palace coup. He was raised as a Christian, but in his youth, he secretly developed a deep and passionate love for the old Greek philosophy and the pagan gods. He saw Christianity as a crude and irrational superstition, and he revered the intellectual traditions of Plato and the mystical beauty of the old rites. When he became emperor in 361 AD,
he decided to use his power to undo the work of his uncle. Julian was not a persecutor in the old style. He knew that creating more Christian martyrs would be counterproductive. Instead, he attempted a kind of pagan revival. He reopened the pagan temples and restored their funding. He wrote philosophical treatises against Christianity. His most clever move was to try and create an organized pagan church, a unified pagan priesthood with a clear doctrine and a focus on charity, directly mimicking the structure that had made the Christian church so successful. But it was too little, too late. The old paganism was too diverse and disorganized to be united in this way. After a short reign of just 2 years, Julian was killed in battle while on campaign against the Persians. His last-ditch effort to save the old gods had failed.
With Julian's death, the last real threat to Christian dominance was gone. The emperors who followed him were, for the most part, devout Nicene Christians. And in the late 4th century, one emperor would take the final, decisive steps to transform the Roman Empire from a state that tolerated Christianity into a state that mandated it. This was Theodosius the Great. Theodosius was a staunchly Orthodox Christian, and he saw it as his imperial duty to enforce religious uniformity across the empire. His reign marked the final reversal of fortunes. For 3 centuries, it had been the Christians who were the outlaws. Now, it would be the pagans. In a series of edicts issued between 389 and 392 AD, Theodosius effectively outlawed the practice of paganism. These laws forbade public animal sacrifice, the very cornerstone of the old religion. They criminalized the worship of the household lares and the consultation of oracles. The state subsidies that had for centuries supported the great pagan temples and the ancient priestly colleges, like the Vestal Virgins, were officially cut off. It was a top-down, state-sponsored revolution. The old gods were no longer to be tolerated. The once persecuted Christian sect was now the sole, official, and compulsory religion of the Roman Empire. The tables had not just been turned, they had been smashed to pieces. The spiritual marketplace was now closed, and a new monopoly was in charge.
The edicts of Theodosius marked the official end of a religious tradition that had sustained the Roman people for over 1,000 years. The consequences on the ground were profound and symbolic. The great pagan temples, deprived of their funding and their worshippers, slowly began to fall into disrepair. Some were looted by Christian mobs, their idolatrous statues smashed. Others were eventually converted into churches. In 394 AD, a final, poignant event took place. The sacred flame of the goddess Vesta, which had burned continuously in her temple in the Roman Forum for over 1,100 years, tended by the revered Vestal Virgins, was extinguished for the last time. The Order of the Vestals was disbanded. It was a powerful symbol that the divine protection of the old gods was officially over. In the same year, the ancient Olympic Games, a religious festival dedicated to the god Zeus that had been held in Greece for over a millennium, were held for the last time, before being banned by the Christian emperor. The great oracle of Apollo at Delphi, which had once guided the course of nations, fell silent. The thousands of local gods and spirits that had been worshipped for centuries were now declared to be demons. The transition was not instantaneous, and pagan beliefs would linger in the countryside for centuries. But the official, public life of the old gods was over. They were now the outlaws, the demons, the superstitions of a bygone age. The small, strange sect from Judea had not just won a place at the table, it had taken over the entire house.
And so, our story of this profound transformation comes to a close. We have journeyed from a world filled with the smoke of sacrifice to a world filled with the scent of incense in new basilicas. We have seen a small, misunderstood Jewish sect grow from a handful of followers into a powerful international institution. We have witnessed its surprising appeal to the poor, to women, to the marginalized. We have followed it through the fires of persecution and seen how the courage of its martyrs only strengthened its resolve. And finally, we have seen it embraced by the very imperial power that once tried to destroy it, until it became the official voice of the Roman Empire. The question of how this happened has no simple answer. It was not just a spiritual victory. It was a victory of community, of charity, of organization, of conviction. It was a story of historical accident, of political calculation, and of a message that arrived at exactly the right time, in a world that was hungry for a new kind of hope. It is one of the most remarkable and consequential stories in all of human history, a slow-motion revolution that fundamentally reshaped the Western world. Thank you for joining me on this long and intricate journey. I hope this story of profound change has provided a quiet and fascinating backdrop for your mind to wander as you prepare for rest. May your own night be peaceful, and may your dreams be filled with a sense of wonder.